Well, the liberal activist group ACORN organizes voting drives across this country. But some say its election activities are not above board. The Consumer Rights League slams ACORN for voter registration fraud and other election abuses. So why would Democrats include money for this group in the bailout bill? Joining us now is James Terry, Chief Public Advocate for the Consumer Rights League. Hi, James.
Hi, Megan. Good to be with you.
All right, it's good to have you. Well, believe it or not, this is still in the bill. That's the latest that we've gotten from our sources on Capitol Hill, which include the lawmakers themselves. The Democrats have included a provision that says not less than 20% of any profit realized from these investments, part of that would go to this group, ACORN. And the House Republicans tell us they are fighting to get this thing removed. It hasn't been yet. James, why is it a problem?
Well, I think it's a problem because when you look at ACORN's structure, they're a massive organization. There are 150 subsidiary organizations with already this year a $110 million budget, and their voter registration activities have spawned investigations in over almost a dozen states. And we're talking about millions of registrations, thousands and tens of thousands of fraudulent registrations, and which is not to even mention that the fact that of that $110 million, a significant portion of this operation is being funded by the taxpayers already. And to put this organization, to earmark money for this organization ahead of the taxpayers is just outrageous.
Why is it described as a liberal activist group? Is it connected officially to the Democrats?
Well, I don't think, they live in a very nuanced world, but I don't think in any official on-paper connection, but I think, you're judged by your actions, and you look at the history of this organization, their relationship with the Democrat Party, the relationship with a lot of the Democrat causes and members of Congress, and I think even if you look at their voter registration drives, I think if you did an analysis of the registrations that they collect, you would see they're overwhelmingly Democrat registrations. Let
me ask you this. They were originally created, I guess, to help lower-income folks get mortgages for zero down and so on. Is that correct? Is that primarily what they do in addition to getting voter registration done?
That is part of it. ACORN Housing Corporation takes a dramatic amount of money from the federal government to help people, ostensibly help poor people get into houses. But one of the things we've seen out of the ACORN Housing Corporation is the very same loan products that they attack and call, what they call predatory, are the very same loan products that they have gone into partnerships with various banks, and we're actually pushing these products on the lower income Americans.
So these bad mortgages are what caused this problem that we're dealing with on Capitol Hill, and now as part of the bailout bill, to solve that problem, lawmakers are considering giving money back to the group that got those problematic mortgages to begin with. Do I have it right?
Absolutely, and I think that these are the kind of things that only can happen in Washington, D.C., because, not only you talk about the modern day practice of this organization, but the roots of this go all the way back to the Community Reinvestment Act and redlining, and, when banks were forced to ignore risk ratios and give loans that they would never have considered. And now, to be sure that once the banks figured out how they could make a ton of money on this, everybody went wild with it. But you can see clearly that even throughout all of this, you have where institutions were incentivized to continue to offer more and more and more of these risky loans because they were getting credit from the government throughout all these various regulatory schemes that were in place.
Assume they deny these charges that you're leveling.
Well, I mean, what they do very often, they will, it's a big shell game. Like I say, they have 150 different subsidiary organizations, and they juggle blame just like they juggle financing. They juggle blame between organizations, and, and particularly on voter fraud, what they'll very often do is they will lay it off to, low-level rogue employees. But the fact of the matter is this is not the first time they've done this. This has been 10 years, 5 election cycles, and that's not a accident, that's a pattern.
Now the Supreme Court issues its strongest opinion in years on voters' rights in America. The court upholds a law out of Indiana that requires voters to show a picture ID at the polls. A Fox News investigation shows how this can prevent fraud. Eric Sean's live in our newsroom with more now. Good morning, Eric.
Oh, Bill, the potential for election fraud starts even before voters get into the voting booth. Step one, those forms you have to fill out to register to vote? One of the worst recent voter scandals happened in Washington State 2 years ago. Voter registration forms for 1,800 people were submitted by the activist organization ACORN. ACORN even threatened to sue election officials there if they didn't accept the registrations. But there was only one problem. Only 6 of the 1,800 names were real people. All the rest were fake. The ACORN workers did admit that they made the names up. You believe this? They actually sat in the Seattle Public Library there at a table and even randomly picked out names from the phone books. One worker said he even would sit at home making the names up and smoke marijuana. Washington Secretary of State Sam Reed pushed to get picture ID for voters into law. Well, by having photo ID, Reed wanted to make sure that people who voted were actually who they claimed to be. But the proposal was rejected by the democratically controlled state legislature in Washington. Lawmakers said it would be too restrictive and unfair. As for the ACORN workers, 7 were prosecuted for felony offenses of filing false information. 1 did go to jail. But John Jones, the head of the state's ACORN office, denies the organization was responsible.
We found out that we had a small handful of morons who decided to take it upon themselves to defraud the people of Washington State.
In the new book, Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, John Fund details the flaws in our electoral system and how Obama's alleged connection to voter registration group ACORN could jeopardize the election in 2008. Joining us now, John Fund. Tying ACORN to Obama, and you're indicating that if there's going to be a throwing of this election, somehow the Democrats and Obama will be the ones at fault.
ACORN is a lawless group. They have had their workers indicted in Seattle, in St. Louis, in Kansas City, in the Detroit Free Press today.
Why is that Obama's fault?
Let me get to that. The Detroit Free Press today reports that thousands of registrations in Michigan are fraudulent. They have been submitted by ACORN. They are linked to ACORN. Obama was not only part of a voter registration drive in Illinois.
How many years ago?
He then became the chief trainer for their conferences, and he was their lawyer for 3 years. I'm simply saying, as part of trying to make sure this election is not going to overtime, I think we have to have truth squads that make sure there's no voter suppression, no voter intimidation, and Barack Obama should denounce ACORN, which he has never done, despite all of the lawless activity. I would say the one group in this country that has flouted the law most often and is flouting the law today is ACORN, and I think we all have a responsibility to look at that organization. The Palm Beach Post and the Miami Herald, which both endorsed Al Gore, found there were 4,000 voters who were felons in Florida who did get the right to vote, and that was also wrong.
Stanley, let's talk a little bit about this. We understand that in one of the versions of the bailout bill, apparently the Democrats tried to give an organization called ACORN 20%. All right, what is ACORN? And then we're going to get into Barack Obama's connection to it. What does ACORN do?
Well, ACORN really is at the root in many ways of the problem here. ACORN is a group of community organizers, and they specialize in putting pressure, really kind of intimidation tactics on banks to get these banks to make high-risk loans to low-credit customers. And, of course, that's very much the source of this whole problem. And they do things like breaking into the private offices of bank officials. They even show up at the homes of bank officials to scare them and their families. They send demonstrators into the lobbies of banks, all to get the banks to make these high-risk loans to people with low credit.
Okay, and what is Barack Obama's affiliation with ACORN?
Well, Barack Obama had very close ties to ACORN, and in particular to the head of Chicago ACORN. Her name was Madeleine Talbot. Madeleine Talbot was an absolute pioneer of these intimidation tactics against banks, and Barack Obama was selected by Madeleine Talbot when he was just sort of a wet behind-the-ears organizer. She recognized his abilities, and she asked him to train her personal staff. When he came back to Chicago from law school, and Madeleine Talbot was really beginning her campaign against these banks, Barack Obama trained the leadership of organizers in ACORN in Chicago.
Oh, man.
And when Barack Obama,
So, Stanley, what you're saying, you're talking about how ACORN in the past has pressured banks to illegally make loans to people who cannot afford houses. So, in effect, you're saying ACORN is one of the foundation or the cornerstones of the crisis that we're in right now.
That's absolutely right. Now, that these loans weren't illegal. In fact, there was a law that allowed ACORN to put on this pressure. The Community Reinvestment Act enabled ACORN to levy complaints against banks when they wanted to merge or expand if they hadn't made sufficient loans in minority communities. And so using this law, ACORN was able to pressure banks into making high-risk loans.
Wow.